All right, welcome back to another episode of the Supply Chaney podcast. I am your host, Nathan Chaney. This is a podcast where we take a moment to talk about the human element of supply chain and take some time to dig in to the little nitty-gritty details of folks' past, but maybe before they were supply chain professionals and on LinkedIn every day, and these personalities that we see at conferences. And today, one of those people is someone that I actually get to interact with quite often at a lot of conferences that I'm at. That's Todd Boone with Dexory, and Dexory just opened up their North American headquarters in Nashville, and I was really excited to be there and be part of the festivities. And today, it's not going to be a 1 or 2 minute soundbite at a conference. It's going to be a full-on podcast with you, Todd. So I'm really looking forward to it. I'm a big fan of Dexory. So without further ado, I'll take a moment and ask you to just do a quick cursory overview of who you are and kind of what you're about, and then we'll dig into the details.
Sure. Sounds great. Thanks for having me, Nathan, and good to see you again. Todd Boone, Vice President of North America for Dexory. I was, in fact, their first employee in North America back in 2024. And just a quick note on that, now suddenly we're right around 40 people. So it feels like, very different than it was before, but also in a really good way. So looking forward to the conversation today and exploring a little bit more about both the supply chain, us, and everything else that we're going to talk about.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you've heard a podcast, you know that I like to go and ask our guests to go pull out the photo albums from when they were younger and share a little bit about, their younger years. So, tell us about, where you were born, what was family life and those family dynamics like. And if you tell me that, both of your parents were in the warehousing technology industry, you're going to blow my mind.
Right. So this is the everything else, I guess, that I was kind of referring to. And yeah, so I was born in Toronto, up in Canada, but have lived in a whole bunch of different areas. So growing up, we used to move around a lot, both within Canada, but as well as in the Middle East for about 5 years. So while my parents were there, I was also at boarding school down in Florida for a few years. So that was fun. And I come from a family of 4. So it's my parents and a sister that I have. So, and we were always like a very kind of tight family unit, which we in some ways had to be, right? Because we moved around so frequently that you wind up get to know your family really, really well. But I think the other thing that it helped establish was, to some degree, a sense of adaptability because I think almost every second year I was the new kid. I think I went to 5 high schools. So pretty much every year I was the new kid, even through high school. And you have to learn how to get into new environments and, meet people and start living life as quickly as possible. And so that's, a little bit of the, the generic background. From a interest standpoint, I was always very interested in sports. I was a competitive swimmer for most of the years from the time I was about 9 years old, which was kind of weird because I was actually afraid of the water until I was 9 years old, and then wound up getting into it and becoming a swimmer. Weirdly, so now I remain an amphibian to this day.
All right. I did not like swimming very much. Maybe similar to you until I was, let's call it 18. And I started running, kind of like Forrest Gump. I just started running. My first love is cycling. So I did cycling and I would do, bike races. And then I was like, let's add to this. Let's start running. So then I'd start running half marathon type things just for fun. Nice. And then I was like, let's do triathlons. But I hate swimming. And so I had a good friend who was like a swimming instructor and a lifeguard. And so she taught me and I was like, it was one of those first experiences for me of this is a thing I intentionally avoid and that I kind of hate with a passion. And therefore I should go force myself to do it. It was one of those first like things like avocados that you just like, it's healthy for you. You just got to learn how to like it. And so that was swimming for me. But tell me about like that journey from, not liking swimming to going on and being a competitor.
Well, I think some of it was because growing up for a bunch of years in Saudi Arabia, I mean, it was hot all the time. And so it became an issue of, am I going to get in this pool and actually maybe be comfortable? Or am I going to sit on the deck and continue to be afraid of the water? And then once I got in, realized that I actually enjoyed it. And because in the Middle East there, I mean, you're not just talking 100 degrees. A lot of times you're talking 110, 120. You're not really going to go out and play baseball or football, and certainly not during the day. And so swimming became, the sport that I did. But there is a masochistic element to it, right? Because it's one of those unique sports in a sense, right? Like, not only can you not breathe when you want to, but it's the simple, I think, reality of just staring at the bottom of the pool that, swimmers joke about it a little bit as well. There's got to be something a little bit off with us to get so much enjoyment out of it. But then even to this day, if I'm out of the water for too long, I find that, I start kind of missing the smell of chlorine and the sound of the water and the feel of the water. So yeah, it stays with you for life.
Well, as niche as things are with swimming, there's even more niches within swimming. So what specific
Right.
sort of strokes, styles, distances did you do?
Well, I guess, I might look at it that I was never great at any of the strokes. So the stroke that I did was the individual medley, which is all four, because I was actually pretty decent at all of them. And so when you put the four together, I actually wound up being really competitive because I didn't really have a weak stroke. And so that was a good thing. But then, and then at the meets, it was typically I would swim whatever we didn't have enough people in for that particular meet. But yeah, no, I was always an IMer, kind of to the heart.
All right. I can't do the breast.
The butterfly. Yeah.
Cannot do that one. I couldn't do that to save my life. So for me, just freestyle crawl, the long endurance triathlon, sort of just long distance stuff.
Which to that point, like, I'm a biker now as well, right? Mountain biking, though, not really road. So I've thought of doing a triathlon, but will admit to this day, I just haven't done one. But I figure I've got the one element that nobody likes except for swimmers is the swimming, right? And then I'm like, I can run decently well and I like to bike. So I'm like, I should put them all together.
I would encourage you. Keep me updated on your progress here on that front. I'm curious. So you saw some places in the world growing up. I'm curious how you feel like that maybe has affected your worldview or your view of how different cultures, of how to work with different people, and maybe how it informed what you thought you wanted to do with the rest of your life.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because it opened my eyes very early because when we were living over there, we actually got the opportunity to get to see most of Europe, most of Asia and everything before I was 18 years old, even. And even as a reasonably young kid, like when I was going to school in Florida, I was actually traveling back and forth to Saudi Arabia on my own on breaks as a 16-year-old, which, I think now, and, I've got 3 kids currently, and I think of letting my, now 17-year-old travel, let's say to, Jeddah or Riyadh in Saudi Arabia on their own. And I'm like, well, would I do that? And so, there's definitely, so I think there's some great things that can come out of it, though, to your point, right? Because it does open up your eyes. You start seeing some different ways of approaching things, right? And some different ways that people do things. But the other interesting element is you also see a lot of similarities, right? In terms of that you meet these people from all over the world and realize that there also can be a lot of commonalities on the core human attributes, right? And you're like, okay, so there's some interesting things to build off with that. But in my opinion, it drives a curiosity. It drives a different way of maybe thinking about things. And it's the type of mindset that, frankly, we've tried to drill into our kids now as well, right? In terms of having that global outlook and that global type of presence, which actually all 3 of them really do, right? Like, even, my middle son, for example, is in the UK right now on a work term, and it's his 3rd time over in the UK doing this. My daughter's done a solo trip through Asia, and those types of things. And the youngest is still maybe a little too young to do some of those things. But, I think to me, it's such an important attribute to be able to have that broader type of view and perspective of how you think about things that, was certainly very important for both myself and my wife to instill.
There's a quote that I saw about this just this past week or so that I won't go dig it up on the podcast, but when we're done, I'll go find it real quick and share it
Yeah.
with you. Um, so you had this kind of this big view of the world, traveling around and having a just a really dynamic, clearly growing up years, and
Yep.
also going from Toronto to Saudi Arabia must have been was a humongous temperature change for you. But curious, help me understand like what you, as you're preparing to leave home and make those next decisions, like, into young adulthood, what kind of path were you on? What did you think you wanted to go do with your life?
Yeah. So from a path perspective, like interestingly enough, I actually, even coming out of high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do from an actual career perspective. And then through university, I would argue the same thing. I just didn't really know or understand what I wanted to do. I knew I likely wanted to do something, with a global sort of outlook and purview, but didn't know what that was. And so I wound up actually going to get my MBA for no good reason other than I didn't know what to do. And it was a co-op program. And my thinking was that the co-op would allow me to at least explore and experience some different things. Right. And I don't think it was that I didn't want to do anything. It's just it was almost like, when you go to the Cheesecake Factory and the menu is so large, you don't know what to order. It was like I just couldn't really focus on what I might want to do. And so every day it felt like a different idea, which my parents used to give me great grief over because they're like, hey, you got to decide. So when I did the work terms actually through the MBA, it was really instructional because suddenly I would argue that I fell into the technology space and realized that I was working in an area that was really dynamic, that was, changing all the time. You've got new products and new things happening, and the pace is very quick. And also, what attracted me to it was that global, opportunity within it, as well as saying, hey, one day, if I want to maybe go somewhere else, then we can chart that path as well. And so that led me into that. And so all three work terms wound up being in the technology space. And then my very first job was in telecom with a company that's no longer around called Nortel Networks. But a big draw to that was the fact that I figured it had those, the attributes that I was looking for, like fast-paced, dynamic, global, and all those types of things. And so that's really what drove the decision. I would say in some ways fell into it. I mean, I think that there's always a directional aspect, right? Like you leaning in some ways, people make their own opportunities based on where the interests are, what you apply for, and all those types of things. But if you had asked me to predict if I would have wound up in the technology space, I wouldn't have been able to give you that answer, when I was like 18 or 20 years old. It really was something that just evolved over time.
All right. I can appreciate that. I
Yeah.
was also one of those undecided people
Oh,
until
yeah.
between sophomore and junior year.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, yeah. And I got suggested, by a teacher to go consider majoring in logistics. And I said, okay, that sounds cool.
Yeah.
And that was it. It was just that one little hallway conversation. Um,
Yeah.
so So talk us through, at this point, kind of like walk us through your career path. So you said you started at Nortel and you kind of stayed on technology. Can you kind of walk us through, the different changes, what drove those things, any lessons learned, as you went through your career?
I guess everywhere there was tons of lessons, right? Like, at Nortel, it was very interesting because when I joined, it was a rocket ship and it was going crazy, even as a multi-billion-dollar company. I mean, it was going, absolutely crazy. And then what was instructional there is how quickly the wheels fell off. And, when the whole telecom industry kind of imploded, right? And then there was like Lucent and Nortel and a whole bunch of, companies that, experienced suddenly very difficult times. So what I did there though was, I initially was in product marketing and evolved into more of a sales role. When sales actually, it was also when the company started its downward spiral and they started mass layoffs. It was one of those funny times, right, where I was actually a channel partner manager and looking after a bunch of accounts, and then I got called into my new boss's office because my previous boss had been let go, and they said, "Hey, now you're a sales engineer." And I'm like, sales engineer? Like, I don't know if I know enough to be a sales engineer. They're like, well, you better learn because we let them all go. And I'm like, well, why would you do that? And so that was also instructional, right? About how sometimes when you see these, these large changes and these big shifts, and especially around layoffs, like you'd like to think they're so well thought through and organized. And a lot of times they're just not, right? Like they needed to hit a certain number and they let whole groups go. Where I think it helped me is suddenly I got more technical in my role, right? And so I started saying, well, okay, I do need to dive deeper into this. And so, that went on for a period of time. And then eventually, Nortel dissolved. I guess shortly before that, I wound up changing paths and I got into the logistics market. And one of my old friends and colleagues had actually shifted into a company at the time called TechLogix, which is no longer around because it was acquired, through a series of, mergers and acquisitions over time. But before that, I had never heard of it. And so once I got in, because basically TechLogix became Scion, became Scion TechLogix, then became Scion, which was then bought by Motorola, which was then bought by Zebra. And so it was like a whole bunch of change. And so I spent a lot of years, I guess, at that overall entity, but it was always changing through roles. And so I think that was really interesting for me because suddenly I went from a multi-billion-dollar company to now a company that was a few hundred million. And, so it was about 800 people when I joined. It gave me the opportunity. So I went out and I managed our Southeast Asia region for a while. So it gave me some of that global capability as well, and more directly in the sales and P&L responsibility and those types of things. Eventually came back, and then with Motorola and Zebra was more on the corporate strategy side. So, and then went full circle back into product management at Zebra, helping them establish what, their automation VU at the time, which got me into automation and robotics. And so it's interesting, right? Like I figure no two paths are ever really the same. In some ways, I never would have expected to have stayed at that entity, I guess, as long as I did, but things kept changing so fundamentally. Like each time with each acquisition, it was a very different type of culture and company. And at the same time, also, I kept changing roles within that. So I felt like it was broadening the horizon. So I kept with it. And I think, with that, funny enough, to your point about coming into logistics, you start saying like, if I go back like 15, 20 years ago, it was maybe a slower market and not really, moving at the pace that it is today. But suddenly it's become such a dynamic tech forward type of industry that, now sort of establishing that base before, I think sets up well going forward because it is such a, it's a great space to be in, right? And it's not going anywhere because as the world's changing, if anything, the logistics supply chain is becoming ever more important.
I really appreciate you sharing that. And I don't know that in the many, many conversations that I've had, I've heard from someone who rode this wave of acquisitions for so many years through so many kind of known names and brands that people are familiar with.
Right.
That's really interesting. So thank you for walking us through that. There's one thing that's just dawned on me now, as you were just saying what you're talking about you didn't see yourself going down the technology path and how logistics was a little bit less of a dinner table type of topic,
Right.
or word, is that to some degree, we think of technology these days as the glue that kind of connects all of us, telecom and the internet and tech. It allows us to all be connected and live our lives. But in many ways, logistics and the physical supply chain is kind of like on a parallel with technology. So you can touch supply chains, you can touch inventory on shelves and trucks and things, and it's the physical movement and the physical connection that brings us all together and connects all of us together, much like technology does. So I think we've come to realize that it's ubiquitous, that it's everywhere, and that we don't survive without it. And it's gotten a seat at the table, in the boardroom and at dinner tables, across the world now because of COVID, I guess, really, But it's interesting to kind of think about that ubiquitousness of logistics and supply chain now.
Well, it's funny, right? Because when you mentioned COVID there too, I mean, people don't really think about everything that happens when they pick up their mobile phone or a telephone and call somebody, right? And to some extent, they don't really care about how it works, or many don't, right? Like all they want to know is, hey, do I get dial tone or do I get the person on the other end and that type of thing. In some ways, logistics has some similar attributes. And I think COVID had this interesting thing because before, nobody really thought about how products showed up at the store. They just expected to get to the store and the product would be there. And what a pain if it's not. But now, I think, particularly when COVID, when the online, like especially the e-commerce boom really started to resonate because the stores were shut down, you saw people, it was almost thrown into their face about, well, wait a minute, how is this actually working? Because now, like, this stuff's showing up with ever faster frequency to my front door. And it's not just the big carriers coming out. Like suddenly it's some guy driving his personal vehicle that's now just dropping off my package. Like, how did that work? Right. And I think people started, like, just out of interest, asking more questions. And the fact that, now I'm ordering stuff and, like, literally the next day, sometimes the same day, it's showing up. And, it's a little bit mind blowing that whereas it used to be potentially ignored, they're going, wait, how did that happen? Right. And I think it drove a curiosity into the space that wasn't really there before.
I feel like the gig economy, and I'm trying to like extrapolate and go even a few couple thousands feet above what you're saying here, which is that the gig economy of gig workers doing deliveries of food, of products, of Airbnb doing people hosting and now playing hotel to people. I feel like the concept of just business in general has gotten pushed more closer to the edges of civilization. So it's not just big corporations that act like a business, but everyone kind of acts a little bit of a business. Everyone's got little side hustles. People got we've got the gig economy. So I feel like it puts business as, capital B business, like in more people's minds because everyone is participating in commerce more than just being consumers of things.
I think that's a great point because, it's before, to your point, you used to go book a hotel or you had to call a taxi, right? Or, right. And now, all these side hustles that people can just do on their own. And by the very virtue of that are probably investigating and learning more about it overall so wait a minute, if I'm going to do this and put maybe not just some money on the docket, but also time, then I want to know enough, like, am I going to be successful at this? I mean, I'm sure some did it just out of, because they had to, but a lot of them I'm sure were like, is this worth it? Right. And they would make the decision that, yeah, I think it is.
The number of Uber and Lyft drivers that have gotten a pen and paper and penciled out how much they're making versus how much their cost per mile is and their upkeep of their car and their insurance and start doing that math, that's at scale. People thinking about what it's like to run a little business and making those kinds of decisions that didn't exist in the past, I think.
No, it's like their own personal P&L, right? Like they're almost budgeting in a way that they might not have if they weren't doing something like this.
Sure. I think we might have just stumbled on something here, Todd. We can keep pulling on this thread at another time.
Exactly.
But I think we could do a talk on stage about this, I think. So, well, let's move the conversation forward here and talk about the present day and Dexory. And maybe we can just talk a little bit about how that conversation started, how they found you, you found them, love at first sight sort of thing. And just talk a little bit about just Dexory and, what problem y'all are trying to tackle and who your ideal customers are and all that sort of good stuff.
Well, it's interesting because a former boss of mine reached out and said, hey, have you heard of this company called Dexory? And I was like, no. And they were, you should really talk to them. Okay. And so it started with that. And I took a look at their website and, interesting. I was like, okay, this is a really interesting approach because what they were looking at was to give full site warehouse visibility in real time, right? Through a digital twin. And that was, in my mind, quite unique. Now, a lot of companies had started going down that visibility road, as had Zebra when I was there, for example, looking at more front of store retail operations. And that was what I was familiar with. So when I heard about it at first in the back of the warehouse, it was a bit of a head scratcher, I'll be honest, at first. And I was like, okay, interesting. And then I'm like, and can it work? And warehouses often are a lot bigger than a retail store, right? So the other part of my brain was like, how are they going to do this? Like a whole warehouse on a daily basis? Like a lot of it just didn't really seem to add up. But then when I started digging a little bit more and talking with the founders, it was like, yeah, this is actually quite interesting. And, because I think what they had done is they had taken an approach that was looking at the problem and saying, what technology do we need to solve it? So, which is upside down, right? Because a lot of times people have a widget and they're saying, now what problem can I solve that I've got this really cool technology? And I think what made this quite unique in my mind was that this was completely upside down, and it was very much a solution first type of mentality in terms of how they were engaging with that market. So that's really what started it. And Dexory is a UK based company. And so when I first started talking with them, there was a thought of, hey, we're brand new. I mean, at the time, I think they just started shipping products like, 6 or 8 months before, the very first conversation with them in Europe. And then it was, well, we're looking at potentially going to North America. We could use some help in terms of what that might look like. And that's really what started the journey in terms of, bringing then that idea and that offering this side of the pond.
For companies in that position, is it, a company that's starting outside of the US or North America, is it kind of just a given that they're going to go and try to tap into, is North America, the market that kind of everyone in the world wants to make sure that they have a presence in?
I think for the most part, the answer would be yes, like especially for technology, and like this type of technology. And a lot of that is just, if you look at the addressable market, like just based on warehouses and, the types of distribution that happens here, that's what drove a lot of the initial analysis in terms of what's the addressable market there, how large is it going to be, how is it clustered, all those types of things. And when you do look at it, you say, from a homogenous market standpoint, right? And by that, I mean, everyone's speaking the same language and it's a constant currency and largely common tax laws and all those types of things, right? Versus, going to country by country by country, each in their own right can be, could definitely be worthwhile, but it can definitely be a larger lift to scale at the same rate. And so that's, I think, part of what drove the argument that, hey, yeah, we definitely need to be looking at the US, and we definitely think that we can scale there faster, which has in fact been the case.
All right. Well, let's take a quick pause and just ask the question of, what is the approach to addressing this, this inventory problem? I believe I, have followed you all for quite a while. I'm very, very familiar, but there's probably a couple of folks that aren't familiar with the technology and the way y'all are going about it. So can you just kind of take a moment to walk us through the, from 101 Dexory?
Yeah. So, at a fundamental level, and so it's interesting, right? We have what we call a full stack solution. And so it's a combination of an autonomous mobile robot and software. And in many respects, we see ourselves more as a software company that's got a really cool robot that's a sensor acquisition platform for us. And when you think of that, like, the robot gets a lot of the attention because it scales up to 60 feet tall. It has a tower that extends, and it goes up to 60 feet tall. But the reason that we do that is because it's equipped with a whole bunch of different sensors. And so that would be like cameras and computer vision types of capabilities, LiDAR, so that as we're going down through an aisle in a warehouse, we're actually scanning from floor to ceiling in one pass. And that's where this vision of having a digital twin of your warehouse really started to, come to life in terms of what we were trying to showcase. So our customers will have a real-time view in 3D of what their warehouse looks like, and they can go to any location. They can see what's there physically. They know what barcodes, so they know what we've scanned there, and they know how much space is being consumed. And so now there's a lot of value in terms of really understanding what's actually there versus what you thought was there. Because as even the most well-run warehouses tend to misplace stuff or to lose stuff. And when you misplace something in a 1 million square foot warehouse, that can actually be a huge operational problem, right? Because it's got this ripple effect. How do you find it? How urgent is it to find it? How many people do you need involved to find it? And so that became like the premise of us building out what we call our integrity platform, which is also now extended to be like, hey, do you have what you thought you had, where you thought you had it, in the quantities you thought you had it? But beyond that, is it also in the condition that you think it should be? And by that, I mean, is the product damaged? Is, let's say, the pallet damaged, right? Or is the pallet tipping over? Because these types of things, not only can they be safety concerns, they can also be operational considerations, right? Because I look at something and I'm like, well, wait a minute, if that pallet's broken, can I even get it off the rack, right? So I might need to go and initiate a rework before the picker goes there to try and grab it, and they realize they can't. So it allows customers to get more proactive just by understanding the baseline of their operation. So now they've got like a real-time view of their operation that can be extremely valuable to help them. And really what our goal here is that, it's not just data and information to have like a bunch of data on your warehouse. It's actually so they can start to prioritize their activities in a way that, well, for all the parts, like imagine you got 1 million square feet and 100,000 locations, and we're saying, hey, 99,000 of these are perfect. They're golden. You don't even have to look at them. You don't need to send people. Everything's where it should be, and what you thought you had is there. But then for the 1% or those 1,000 locations, you can really zero in the operations to go and get ahead of that, so you're not getting impacted by stuff, when you're in the midst of trying to do it, but actually you can fix things before they become an issue.
And when we're talking about these kinds of numbers, a 1% error rate actually is not great. Typically you want to be shooting for a 0.1 or 0.01 type of error rate, right? I'm curious, do y'all have any math? Y'all have been doing this for a minute now, and I feel like you all are kind of like industry leaders in this space. So is there a math or a scientific formula that you've kind of come up with to be able to like determine what the cost of an error is in some sort of way?
Yeah, no, interestingly enough, we don't really have like the cost of an error per operation. It tends to vary by operation. What we do have is a framework to help customers understand what their cost per error might be. Because funny enough, we ask a lot of customers if they understand what an error costs them, and a lot do not. Some do, and they actually have like a quantified amount that they put on there, but many do not. And a lot of times it's almost an analysis of saying, okay, so let's say you go to pick a pallet that's not there. What happens next? Or let's say you go to put a pallet away with directed, put away, and there's a pallet in the way. What happens? And when you start walking through the next steps, who's involved, right? And how long it takes, then you start to be able to craft out what a particular cost per error is. And I think there's two things that come to light here. A lot of customers, when they do this analysis, at first they think, the cost of an error is probably like, $25, $30. We're not sure. Well, if you talk to like a Gartner or a VDC, they say like, $150 to $300, right? But a lot of customers, when they've actually done the analysis themselves, sort of zero in around $100 per error, which we think is probably on the conservative side, but still gives us, I think, a frame of reference to start understanding what the value of accuracy is, right? Or what the cost of not being accurate might be. And so I'd say that's one side of the coin. And I would say the other thing is, you talked about that accuracy number. A lot of customers base their accuracy assumptions based off doing a physical inventory, right? So they're like, well, the last time we did an inventory, we were like 99.6% accurate. Well, what they don't tell you is they spent 2 weeks getting ready for that physical inventory. And then they went and counted and got everything ready. And then hopefully it remains like that, which we know isn't necessarily always the case. What we do see with a lot of customers is typically about a 3 to 5% delta between what they thought their accuracy level is and when we actually go and scan it, what their accuracy truly is. And so, there's a foundational element here, which can be quite eye-opening. One of our customers said, hey, like we were a bit surprised because when we did the first few runs with Dexory, like it lit up like a Christmas tree, right? Because we've got like a red, amber, green sort of framework. And he was like, there was way more like red and amber there than we ever would have hoped. But they very quickly then get ahead of it because again, they know where to focus. So you don't spend time looking at the areas that don't need attention. You really zero in on where you do need attention.
I'm curious about your, we talk about inventory accuracy and visibility and knowing where things are.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious from your perspective or from Dexory's perspective, I feel like supply chain visibility is the kind of, one of the buzzwords of this decade. I'm kind of curious, like what kind of definition you all assign to this concept of supply chain visibility and knowing where your stuff is.
I mean, I kind of equate visibility to predictability. Right. And so it's really hard for your operation to be predictable always if you don't really understand what's there, because if you don't actually have a ground source of truth, then you're making assumptions based off of modeling, right? Whereas when you actually understand exactly what's where and what you need to do next, that gives you a level of predictability that you can start to inject in your operations that might not be there if you're just modeling, right? Because this brings us, kind of like to the next level of where we're looking to go is if you think of that we're providing a data foundation, of like now a much higher sort of ground truth, if you will, right? Of really understanding what's there. That's going to help you make better decisions, right? Because now if you're moving things around, you actually know you're moving them around, but you can also start to get more predictive with it, right? Like you can start to lean into things like, well, wait a second, it's peak coming up. Our capacity is like, we think it's really full, but is it really full, right? Like, and when I talk of things like that, it's like, well, are there opportunities for consolidation? Consolidation might be that you're putting the same products on, like, the same, obviously, and building up the pallets or, grouping them together or what have you. It could also mean that, well, wait a second, I've got a bunch of really small pallets in large slot locations, right? So we've got some shorter bay locations, higher bay locations, yet we've got a whole bunch of short ones in high bay locations. Maybe if we move them around, we can free up more room. So we actually give the intelligence on both sides of the coin that people can start looking at their operation in a guided way where we help them focus in terms of, hey, here's some things that you could do to really run your operation better.
I like it. Okay.
Yeah.
Curious, you've talked and you've thrown out this big number out there, million square feet, 100,000
Yep.
pallet locations. I've run some warehouses and managed some things in my day, and none of them were 1,000,000 square feet.
Yep.
So I'm curious, what is your ideal customer profile? What is like number of pallet locations, square footage, amount of activity? Like what kind of is the starting point where someone can where it makes sense to talk with y'all?
Well, this is one of those funny things, right? Like, and in warehousing, it's often like that. It depends, right? And I know that's like the worst possible answer, but here's how I would frame it. We look at 3 V's, like value, velocity, and volume. And so you're right, like a lot of the supersized warehouses, like 1,000,000+ square feet, those are a little bit of the rarity. Like if you look at where the sweet spot, the market metrics would suggest the average warehouse size is, I think, between 3 to 550,000 square feet, right? And we play really well in that from a size perspective. Now, we actually are also very active in manufacturing. And in manufacturing, the reason I bring that up is because some of the sites there were doing more like 50,000 square feet. But where that, visibility plays a disproportionately important role in the sense that if I'm out of a part, does that do a line side stoppage? And then how much does that line side stoppage cost me? So it can be somewhat different than like a 3PL or a distribution type of environment. If we're looking at distribution types of environments as well, then so there's kind of like that size is one metric, but then how quickly is stuff moving, right? The velocity that we're turning, because every time there's a touch point, that's when there's an opportunity for an error. And it's not, again, people aren't necessarily trying to make mistakes. Like imagine a case pick type of operation where, you pick something up, you realize it's the wrong thing and you go put it back. You don't realize you put it in the slot next to it or the slot below it or something like that. Like people aren't trying to make those mistakes, but they're getting measured on how fast they're going. Right. And especially if it's high velocity, there's probably even more pressure to have that as one of your KPIs. So velocity has a big impact in our value equation as well. And then the last one is the valuation of the goods. Like we were just actually on a call earlier today with a medical device company that, the average, cost of a pallet for them is very large, right? Compared to like, let's say, I don't know, cans of peas or something like that, right? Like it's
paper goods. Yeah.
Paper goods. Yeah. Like it's just such a different model, right? And so for them, finding out and understanding exactly where everything is because it's of such a high value is also exceedingly important. So we tend to tie those 3 factors together. So, and that helps us then premise it, is this a really good customer fit for us or not? A more generic answer to your question though, is a lot of times like anything about 250,000 square feet and up, and like, as I said, it can sometimes be smaller, but usually then we can often be a very good fit depending on the other 2 factors as well.
I'm a big fan of alliteration. After all, supply chain is our mission is to be a creative, connected, and capable supply chain resource. I love me some alliteration, but the three V's that you painted there, I really paint a really clear picture. And I think helps me at least answer that
Yep.
question of no, it's not just about size. It can also just
Right.
it can be 50,000 square feet that turns over once a day, or it can be dealing with $500,000 medical devices that each one of them that you lose is going to hurt someone's feelings. So,
Yeah.
no, it makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate you sharing, that, concisely. Really well done there.
Cool.
As we wrap up here, we could probably continue this conversation for another hour or two,
Yep.
but in the interest of time, any like last thoughts or nuggets of wisdom beyond what you've already shared? I've picked up a few, but any other ideas to leave the audience with as we exit today's episode?
Yeah, I think, the last thing is I think this industry is getting more and more important, right? As we were talking, I mean, if nothing else, right? I mean, the supply chain is becoming like a critical lever in the economy overall. And we think that, we look to be a key enabler within that for customers going forward, and to some extent feel that we're just getting started. I mean, where we really look is, at that ground source of truth and that foundational data layer. We think going from that, we can actually make everything better too, right? Because now for a lot of your decisions, you can be doing it off a baseline that you have more confidence in. And so as more companies are leaning into AI, and of course, and as we're leaning into AI to enable different, and very precise outcomes for our customers, we're doing it with a level of confidence that we think that, hey, based on your role, based on what you're specifically trying to achieve, we can help guide you in a very efficient way to get there. And I think those types of things are going to become more important in the industry and at a more macro level. And so I would say that, this is, the last thought is I think this would be is going to continue to be a really exciting space because, in some ways it had been, as I mentioned at the beginning, clicking along and, there were slight modifications to it over time and those types of things. But in the last decade or so, and now, and it feels like it's accelerating, that pace of change is going to increase, both because expectations are changing, both of consumers, but also I think the recognition of just how important the supply chain is, like just to economies in general, right? It's going to continue to get that level of focus.
All right. And as a supply chain industry fanatic, I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
I'm in alignment. So thanks for taking a minute to come on and share more of the story that I'm not able to tease out of you out at the conference show booths. And look forward to seeing you at the next one here soon, I'm sure.
Sounds great.
All right.